Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Jack Threlfall Show. This is the interview segment for this week's episode, and we're joined by a very, very special guest, Hannah Prydderch. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Brilliant. Now, Hannah, could you explain a little bit about what your role is in motorsport?
So at the moment, I work as a writer for WTF1. I'm very fortunate having had the opportunity since November of last year. I've also along the way covered Formula 2 for InsideF2 as both a writer and an editor, and been a writer covering Formula E for Motorsport Week. So I've had quite a varied journey and dabbled in a little bit of YouTube and things like that.
Brilliant. And then is it covering not only Formula 1, but also those junior series? Is that quite important to kind of bring that full scale of motorsport, not only Formula 1?
Absolutely. I think that's one thing I've been very fortunate to be able to push in my role, was the fact that Formula 1 is such an interconnected sport. As much as it is the pinnacle of motorsport, it's not the be all and end all. So say, for example, with Formula 2 at the moment, I'm looking into how the academies will play into the potential Formula 1 seats for next season. We've got an interesting dynamic in that Guanyu Zhou has obviously got the promotion to Alfa Romeo this season. And a lot of kind of major outlets don't necessarily know who he is because they've never covered Formula 2. Whereas I've actually previously spoken to him. I interviewed Oscar Piastri and also spoke to him literally just after he'd won the Formula 2 title, which was less of a bit gutting when you see him and knowing that he's not going to get a seat, but also knowing how much incredible talent's coming up through the ranks. And then also W Series as well, having covered that. And Formula E, there's a couple of chances they've either had potential shots in Formula 1 already or could have lined up for a seat that have gone there. And it's just so varied. And even things like World Endurance and IndyCar, I've managed to be able to dabble in a bit more.
Absolutely. So let's start with Guanyu Zhou then. When we talk about his promotion to Formula 1, I think for a lot of people, it raises a question about, Formula 2 is meant to be the champion of Formula 2, and maybe the guy that comes second should get that seat in Formula 1. But with Zhou, you're looking at someone who has had multiple seasons in Formula 2 and without winning the title, has still been able to put the budget and the resume together to secure that Formula 1 seat. So could you explain maybe a little bit about his history as a driver and why he got that seat?
Yeah, so Guanyu Zhou's kind of had a mixed, say, junior career. He was originally part of the Ferrari Driver Academy around the same time as the likes of Callum Ilott, who is now over in IndyCar. Came through the ranks, won a couple of Formula 4 championships, got stuck in Formula 3 for a couple of seasons around the same time as Mick Schumacher, and then came up to Formula 2 in 2019 and was actually he won the Antoine Hubert Award for basically the highest performing rookie that season. And everyone was touting that he was going to be the first Chinese driver in Formula 1, or the first full-time Chinese driver in Formula 1, I should say. And then last year, I don't know whether it was to do with the tyres or just a very unfortunate season, he didn't have much luck, struggled down towards the middle of the kind of pack. This time around, he had a much more promising campaign as part of the Alpine Academy, had been apart for about 2 years. The problem was he had probably both having a great season in terms of his performance and fighting for the championship, but in the Alpine Academy, he had Oscar Piastri, who was the reigning Formula 3 champion and now Formula 2 champion. And when this is your third campaign versus a rookie, ultimately the rookie's performances are going to be more impressive. And the difficulty as well that he struggled to have that consistency that Oscar Piastri had. And therefore, a lot of people, I think, have bashed him unfairly. When a lot of people go with that pay driver mentality, I think they think of the likes of Nicholas Latifi or even Rio Haryanto back in the Manor days, like people that were never on the radar for one. Guanyu Zhou has always been on the radar in some shape or form. Yes, that money and sponsorship has helped. I'm not going to lie. He has had that advantage over Oscar Piastri, but in the end of the day, he has the super license points. I think that's probably the bigger indication of the issues with Formula 1 and getting those juniors up and promoted is how they operate the super license points at the moment. But whether he'll perform in Formula 1, I think, is an interesting question. I think with Valtteri Bottas, they've got a solid lineup and he's not going to be the worst driver in the history of Formula 1. It's just whether Formula 1 should have, say, a promotion system like the Premier League does, where the champion always gets promoted from the championship up to the Premier League.
Absolutely, because you can look at someone like Nick de Vries, who not only won the Formula 2 championship, but then went on to win Formula E last year. And it seems like those championships independently are valuable, and it takes a lot of skill to win them. But I think especially in the eyes of the junior drivers, when you're talking about their long-term dream, it is to get that Formula 1 seat. And it seems like those are steps along the path for Nick de Vries, who is looking to get back into Formula 1. But what can he do when he's now out of Formula 2, winning Formula E? It feels like he's, where's the path back in for him when there are always going to be those new juniors coming through? Do you see a potential for a Nick de Vries Formula 1 transfer, or is he going to be just the Formula E champion for a while now? What do you think about that?
That's always a tough one. I think with Formula E, the difficulty is the FIA's got its heart set on this kind of road to Formula 1, and it's very much kind of like a tree trunk straight line, and then branches out into their various other world championships like World Endurance. A lot of them dovetail, say, Formula E with that. I think for Nick de Vries, the situation is probably his age. It feels weird saying that because he's only around my age, but he's too old at this point in time. You've got to be very much 21, 22 at the oldest to secure a Formula 1 seat. Now, look at Theo Pourchaire for the potential Alpha seat next season. He's 18? He's hadn't even passed his driving test before he drove in Formula 2.
Yeah, like Max.
And that is the strange thing. I think Max Verstappen's rise held the kind of that very much push on the younger driver, the better, but also restricting the age limit to 18. And I can't see de Vries going over, potentially maybe in the future. There is the possibility. The one bit, the anomaly I find that is actually quite irritating is with IndyCar. I don't tend to follow as much of that circuit, but there was a lot of the discussion around Colton Herta moving over.
Yeah.
And IndyCar, despite its prestige, one of the biggest championship over in America, actually gives them less super license points than Formula 2 does. So he was at
I didn't know that. Okay.
Yeah, he was at a disadvantage having it does, I think, give a very European centric mindset to how the FIA operates at the moment. Same things like W Series. Obviously, Jamie Chadwick's won it twice, but has only had super license points this season. But then also looking at the equivalent, like it used to be called Renault 3.5 and Formula Regional, they actually give more points, even though they're the same cars. And it does, I just think at the moment they have branched it into a too narrow situation where you're going to have more and more paid drivers, because to afford a Formula 2 seat, it can cost around 2 million for one season alone. And unless you've got big sponsors or parents that are willing to fund it, you're not going to see the likes of Lewis Hamilton coming up through the ranks anymore.
And then also IndyCar, it has its own junior structure there. But even you reach the top of that IndyCar junior structure, and it's still not like, it's still almost a subset as the European, the top level in America is equal to the second level of European, even though those drivers are not 22, 21-year-olds. A lot of the time they're experienced, they're champions, they're winners on ovals and street tracks and traditional circuits, but it's just not valued in the same way. It seems really interesting that there's this stock of like Alex Palou started out in the European Junior Formula Series and was successful with people like Carlos Sainz, who's around that generation, and then made that decision to jump over to IndyCar and showed that it could be successful. So whether is it like Lundgaard and Eilert, similar moves for them to make, if they can replicate it, it's kind of treading that path a bit more and making it a bit more obvious for that transfer from Europe to America to be made, I think could definitely change up the driver market a bit, alongside evolution of Formula E, the rise of, I think, the way people value Formula E, like how difficult and competitive it is, has definitely risen in the last few years. So I think it's, as we spoke a little bit about at the start, having a wider, more global perspective on motorsport is definitely going to establish kind of a better angle for, I'm sure your writing really benefits from that perspective.
Absolutely. I think as well with Formula E as well, the fact that it became a world championship, obviously wasn't for its early seasons, now has increased that prestige and that element of this now being, for a lot of the drivers, say the likes of Mitch Evans, this is the only championship they compete in, whereas previously drivers used to skip Formula E rounds to compete in World Endurance, and that's a lot less common these days. And then you've also had the likes of Antonio Giovinazzi going over, even though that does end up having the converse situation of people going, oh, Formula E is a dumping ground for ex-Formula 1 drivers. Actually, I would argue that sometimes you don't tend to see a pay driver situation in Formula E in the same way you do in Formula 1. But then with IndyCar as well, I think definitely with the likes of Lundgaard and Eilert going over, it presents an incredibly important and potential opportunity for them to pass back into Formula 1. I think the actual one to definitely keep an eye on is Arrow McLaren's Pato O'Ward, because he did the Abu Dhabi test. Absolutely. And with the situation of whether Ricciardo will stay beyond his contract, who knows, will that be a potential new lineup for McLaren, because they currently don't really have a junior team, and the same with the likes of Red Bull and Mercedes do.
I think, well, I mean, also with the commercialization of Formula One in America, I think we spoke about with Zhou, the economic side of the sport. With someone like O'Ward, he is his own driver and has his own success. He doesn't need to pay for a seat at all. But I think the way McLaren, how successful they've been with marketing Lando, he's one of the most popular drivers on the grid. In 3 years, he's more popular than some of the veterans. If they can bring in a Mexican-American driver that's going to appeal hugely to the American market, I mean, that's a huge step for McLaren. I think to be with Zach as well, to take advantage of that side of the sport and integrate their IndyCar and their Formula One team. I mean, we've seen with the liveries, right? They've looked to integrate those, especially with Extreme E as well. Integrating that and creating that kind of global motorsport team across categories, it could be really valuable for McLaren. I think as we've spoke a little bit about how the drivers go through their stages of growing their career, I think I can pull a bit of a thin string there and draw that to the progress of your career and how you've been able to be successful in achieving your role with WTF1 and these different junior series websites. Could you speak a little bit about what your expectations were when you started motorsport journalism? Were you just a fan like the rest of us, or was it a desire to be a journalist that became sports journalism? How was it framed for you? What were your expectations?
To be honest, I don't really think I had any expectations. It was a kind of converse series of circumstances. So it was around the time I realised this the other day, it'll be 2 years in about a couple of weeks' time from the first time I ever produced a video on Formula One. I had left my job, and around the time lockdown had hit, and therefore I was like, right, what do I want to do with my life? I had just finished my law degree at Lancaster, and was like, right, I've got to come up with a new path. I decided law wasn't really for me. I'd previously done a lot of kind of politics and democracy work, and decided actually I wanted to find something that I'm truly passionate about, and Formula One and motorsports in general had always been there. I joke, I was pretty much raised on two things, Formula One and rugby. Having been Welsh, is growing up as a kid, Michael Schumacher was my idol. I used to even joke that Michael Schumacher was my dad when I was in primary school. It was that much of a thing for me. And at the end, I had made some friends with some people on Twitter and found that we had a lot in common around sports, and decided to found my own YouTube channel called The Purple Sector. Started creating content there, and then realised actually I had a passion for writing. I'd always loved to do it when I was in school, but never really saw journalism as a viable career option. I think journalism often has a reputation, especially sports journalism, of a heavily male-dominated industry. Also, usually upper class. I come from a very working class background. University isn't cheap by any stretch of the means, so I kind of thought it wasn't an option. Whereas now, I was very fortunate with the kind of Welsh funding structure. I could decide, right, if I wanted to pursue this, I could, and I applied for the Cardiff University course covering news journalism, because I thought I'll try news and can always swap over at the end of the day. Got that, and then, funny enough, just through doing videos, I ended up having the owner of InsideF2 contact me and asked if I want to start writing covering Formula 2, and then from there kind of started my degree. And then someone got in touch about the role at Motorsport Week covering Formula E, and then eventually just kind of snowballed from there. But I always laugh at the fact that the first ever press conference I ever did wasn't actually anything to do with motorsport.
Right.
It was the Wales men's under-21s football team, because I had turned to my tutor and said, I want to do, whilst at uni, I want to cover sport. And he said, right, go out, go and see what you can do. And I ended up getting accredited by the Welsh Rugby Union, the FIA, and the Welsh Football Association, and went from there and found that a lot of those skills kind of traverse between sports, and having that wide breadth of sports that I could cover. I covered darts at one point, I've covered rally or netball or hockey. It just gave me so much more experience that's handy because in sport it's very rare you'll be able to specialise in one sport, because a lot of the national platforms need you to be kind of a jack of all trades.
So in the first days of the Purple Sector YouTube channel, was it really important that you were able to connect with like-minded people on social media and find a group of not only an audience for your content, but also people to make content with? What was that like, seeking out collaborators and sharing your ideas and realizing that that shared passion was there and there was really an opportunity to have some success and make some good stuff.
It was great. I think Twitter's one of them, especially Twitter, I think is one of them places that oftentimes can be quite hostile on social media. It tends, I think probably this Formula One season has exemplified it more than anything.
Definitely,
it's just how polarizing it can be. Sometimes you can't even have a conversation, but other times you can find those communities. I know so many people, to be honest, some of my closest friends in the industry, I wouldn't have met without it. And I think that element of being able to share ideas, share content, for me, I was a big pusher on wanting to encourage more women into motorsport and encourage a more diverse background. I also did some social media work for Racing Pride, the Motorsports LGBTQ plus organisation, because there wasn't, oftentimes I think there was a perception that the industry wasn't for them, whereas now, looking at the growth on social media, there's so many amazing female content creators out there and so many more people that are from a similar background to me and a more diverse background overall, which is incredible. And it allows the fans to feel more connected, because sometimes I would watch videos, like, for example, I love Josh Revel's videos.
Oh, yeah, he's good. Yeah.
Absolutely amazing. And I love them. And then you think, actually, I have a lot of quite similar opinions, quite different opinions on some things. Actually, let's go and put them into words. Sometimes videos would work. I think the one thing you kind of learn with YouTube and any form of production very quickly is things can work one day and look terrible the next, but it's ultimately about that progression and getting more comfortable and confident on camera. And I was lucky that during the early stages of my degree, I applied for Formula E's Young Talent Call for a presenter and actually got shortlisted to one of the finalists. Never would have thought that would happen, because I'd never presented in my life other than a PowerPoint presentation at university. It was never really a thing I'd done, but it was just having that experience and finding those communities. And I wouldn't have done it without social media having given me a platform to be able to express my opinions and not being afraid to have them. I think that's these days a thing that a lot of people worry about. Ultimately, if you're a fan of anything in the world, you're going to have an opinion on it. And it's about finding the right way to communicate those opinions. Have a debate. I love having Twitter debates with people, as long as they're sensible and as long as they're respectful. Ultimately, at the end of the day, I think that mutual respect is sometimes that when things get so polarized can be missing from it.
So who are some of your favorite creators or creators that inspired you in those early days, that really showed you what your content style was going to be as a presenter, and how did you take inspiration from creators and kind of evolve your own style in that way?
I think it was kind of a mix. I think Josh Revel was one of the first. Tomo F1 was also, he was kind of one of the first YouTubers I ever saw go really, really big in terms of, I think it was around the time of his Alex Albon he was doing a lot of content on Alex Albon, and then suddenly out of nowhere, there was just this big boom of content creators. I think also, I probably should give her a shout out, is Katie Fairbairn at WTF1, which I joke I am a bit biased on working with them, but I think the fact that she comes across so eloquent, but also herself on camera, I think that's the fact of having a personality. I don't like the idea of being devoid of personality when you're presenting, because I think that ultimately gives it life, and the fact that you ultimately yourself engages with people. If people wanted to watch a carbon copy of things, they wouldn't watch certain content if it didn't have that liveliness to it. I was thinking in terms of writing as well, as not so much in terms of video, because she doesn't do content producing, but in terms of writing, was Hazel Southwell. She is one of my favorite people, and she covers Formula E incredibly, especially places like Race Fans and The Drive. And it was having that confidence and knowledge. And we were at the Jaguar Season 8 car launch last year, and even then, because she knows far more about cars than I do, just like road cars and automotive industry in general, I couldn't believe how much she knew. She was like an encyclopedia, and it had the element of, actually, we know our stuff in the industry. Is not to be, I think sometimes there's also, I don't like the phrase false modesty, but I think sometimes we're often afraid to believe that we do know something when we do, and actually having that confidence to be like, actually, no, I know what I'm talking about, and I can talk about it clearly and concisely and generate these kinds of discussions. But yeah, there's lots of amazing content out there. I spend most of my evenings literally going through my YouTube recommended. There's that many.
Sure. I've been checking my YouTube analytics a lot today because of the Michael Massey news, because some of my clips have been picked up by the algorithm. So every few hours, I'd be like, all right, how many views has this got this hour? Checking the stats, guys. It's quite satisfying to watch them go up. It's nice.
Yeah.
Do you
I
think
have that with news.
No, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, I have that with news stories all the time, like seeing the analytics in the end of last season going, I've never had this many people read a story ever before in my life, and just seeing that growth and knowing your hard work's paid off at the end of the day. I think there's nothing more satisfying than seeing an article and seeing someone's comment saying I've learned something, or I've provoked, not say a debate, but a discussion around a topic. I think that there's nothing more satisfying than it.
And is that personal connection with your audience, being able to get comments and feedback and have direct engagement, is that something that's motivating to you, or can it be frustrating at times too?
I'd say both. I think sometimes frustrating in the sense when you see something written that's either the worst one is the fact that I've been accused of being both a biased Lewis Hamilton fan and a biased Max Verstappen fan in the same article, even when it's not on them. And sometimes it is a frustration when you've said something in an article and you stand by your judgment. People don't have to agree with me. If we all agreed with each other, it'd be a pretty boring place. But not necessarily understanding that someone else might have the same or different opinion than them. It doesn't mean one's right and one's wrong. It just is an opinion at the end of the day. It's not a fact. It does get frustrating, but it also is so equally rewarding. And having, with WTF1, that is actually one of the greatest things, is it's a platform by fans for fans, which isn't like so many other major publications out there. We can have that dialogue and that engagement. I'll get article ideas, literally scrolling through comments on the article and going, when everyone was talking about Michael Massey getting sacked months ago, people were going, well, I don't know who can replace him. I don't even know who the deputies are. I don't know who this person is. So I wrote an article, literally waiting for the moment to see if Massey was going to get sacked, to say, here's who's come out. When Formula E changed the qualifying format, I was able to cover that break it down into the steps for people who had never watched Formula E before. And then people came back and commented and said, oh, I read your article, I've watched it, I actually quite enjoyed it, and I'm going to watch more races now. And that level of satisfaction, knowing that your article has helped someone learn something, and then also giving you ideas in the process and generating conversations. I've had so many articles now that have just come up from random ideas that I've had while scrolling through social media. It's the best place to find stories, even if it's either news, because I joke Twitter seems to find out everything before anyone else does, but also then generating, say, features and more lengthy discussions. And even YouTube, unfortunately, I'm able to write scripts as well for the channel, so getting to cover things like pay drivers and all that. So then Matt, our presenter, can go out and kind of put his own unique twist on them. He has his own unique twist on stories. Tommy does stuff on socials, and Kate does stuff kind of across all three as well. And then even putting really random pop culture references into stories. I joke I never could have done that at a major news platform, but I get to do it there.
And so is that something, do you think specific to WTF1, or you said it's a big reason behind the success of it as a channel, that it promotes that kind of close fan engagement? Is that one of the reasons why you wanted to work there?
It definitely was. I think kind of WTF1 was kind of the big platform that got me into Formula One journalism, in the sense of across the years I was an avid subscriber of their YouTube channel, watched their videos constantly, especially things like Internet's Best Reactions. I joke, I actually do laugh at the fact that I appeared on it once.
Oh, congratulations.
Yeah, I just remember this was before I worked for them, but I appeared on it, and it was just one of them moments of going, it is that reciprocal relationship at the end of the day. I think it's seen a lot more now in content creation, that bond. I think also it's exemplified more, say, with the change in the teams as well. Like I remember back when Sebastian Vettel was at Red Bull, and Red Bull were a hip social team because they went and did funny jokes and funny videos with him and Daniel. And then nowadays you've got like McLaren launching their car on Roblox.
Right. Wow.
Like that kind of engagement with their fans you wouldn't have seen 10, 20 years ago. There was very much, I think, during probably Bernie Ecclestone's days of F1, kind of a glass screen between the fans and Formula One. That's completely shattered now. There's so much more open relationship, partially through Drive to Survive, whether some elements of it are good, some elements of it not always so good, is kind of up for debate. But I think that with WTF1 and with a lot of the platforms now, we're so fan focused, we can have the conversations that, say, BBC can't have the same discussions about certain topics because the impartiality rules don't allow it at the end of the day, whereas we can have these discussions and talk about it in a way that's accessible. I think that's one of the best bits, is that accessibility. We don't assume fans know stuff, but also we don't make people feel bad for not knowing things. Like, for example, when we've had rules about tyres being changed during red flags, or the gentleman's agreement. I joke, that gentleman's agreement, the name of it, no one knows. If you're a dedicated fan, you know what it is. If you've never watched F1 before, you've seriously got to ask, what's a gentleman's agreement? Why does it exist? And oftentimes you can Google it, but articles covering it will just say a gentleman's agreement and won't explain what it is. If I have to add one line explaining a topic that makes it easier for 1,000 fans to understand, then it's worthwhile at the end of the day.
And are there some examples of some of your favorite articles you've written throughout your career, or ones that you felt were particularly important in why you were able to achieve the success that you've achieved? Some standout moments, maybe?
Oh, I'm trying to think. I think to be honest, one of my favorite standout moments. Oh, you've actually put me on the spot there. I think with WTF1, there's just a lot that I've enjoyed covering, and I think, to be honest, I've mentioned probably the ones I love most, that Formula E article. I qualify for, but I still love it. I love the fact that I get to cover it, even though it's a Formula One platform. A lot of the stuff around Formula 2 and W Series. I think actually my favourite article, though, that I've ever done had to have been for The Independent. It was an interview with Oliver Bennett from Extreme E. It was just a bit of a kind of random spur of the moment. I was on placement there, and they kind of got in touch with me after the placement finished and said, oh, we want someone to do an interview with this Extreme E driver. Are you up for it? And I was thinking, probably the biggest interview I've ever done at this point, really nervous. He actually owns an energy drink business alongside racing. He also does rallycross as well. And the energy drinks brand he owns sponsors the team and also works with Extreme E themselves. I interviewed him. Lovely. Well, the loveliest bloke you'll ever meet. And it was one of the moments of seeing that article go out and finding a way to make it relatable, because I think for The Independent, a lot of their audience had never seen Extreme E before, didn't have a clue what it was. For fans, but actually it's a young British entrepreneur going out racing in this innovative, environmentally conscious series. Look what actually is, and look at the person behind it. I think I love the idea of being able to communicate the people behind the visor in a sense. I think that's the thing that makes journalism great sometimes, is that storytelling of who people are, because I think that's often lost in a media perception where we're so focused on a handful of social media clips or a photo. Being able to allow people to come across in their own words and not kind of putting words in someone else's mouth. And I'd say that is probably my favorite article. Or comparing I had when I was on placement with the Express, the European Super League break the day my placement started, and so I was like, right, I like football, but I know a lot of people that don't. Let's find a comparison. And fortunately, Formula One had a similar situation in about 2008. So I was like, right, Formula One breakaway series, how Formula One avoided it and how football can avoid it in the future. And it was fun to see the reaction of that, because some people who were newer fans had never heard of this going on and didn't realise it could.
Yeah, I hadn't heard of it. I remember that story. I think I must have read that. I remember people, first of all, the death of football, one of the worst moments. Going on Twitter and watching the death of football happen before my eyes was absolutely terrifying. But then also what was interesting was, that story of saying, Formula One tried to do this. I remember at that time thinking, oh, I didn't know that. And I think that concept of a breakaway series was extremely foreign to people. The idea that you could go out and say, like, we're not going to have promotion and relegation. Obviously, there's not direct promotion and relegation in Formula One, but you won't. It's like an economic relegation in Formula One. Like, if you lose for too often, you just will get bought out. But I think, using Formula One to explain other parts of sport is also quite an interesting angle and can make people both directions. Fans of football will look at the Formula One story they hadn't heard before, and maybe Formula One fans will look at the football story. I think you touched on their Extreme E. We have the Extreme E season opener this weekend. What do you think about how they've progressed as a series? Do you think that they're moving in the right direction and they're making the changes they need to kind of increase in popularity?
definitely think so. I think there's it's hard with the new series. I think best comparison probably is Formula E in this situation, is there's always going to be teething problems. Like Formula One is over 70 years old, and as we saw in Abu Dhabi, they've still got teething problems after all that time. You're never going to please everyone, but I think Extreme's taken a lot of lessons. I think the fact that they've got obviously the likes of Jenson Button's team, Nico Rosberg, Lewis Hamilton involved, they've got some amazingly talented drivers. The fact that they've done that one seat has to be filled by a female driver, couldn't be happier. The fact that they're getting the spotlight, and also the fact that it's broadcast. I think that the fact that they'll be on, I think it's ITV this time around, is crucial to get that exposure. Formula E has the situation, they now have the deal with Channel 4, but part of their season is broadcast on YouTube, part of the season's on TV, and it just means fans can't easily access that series, and it ultimately does come at the cost of the championship at the end of the day, because it doesn't get that exposure. Whereas Extreme seems to have a bit more of a grasp on it. I also think the format is incredibly interesting. The fact that they're not they're not scared to change things if things don't work. They've just released the format changes, and I actually need to fully read up on them to get a grasp of them. But they do have a mix of like a crazy race and qualifying different heats and things like that. It's the 6th format change that they've had. Yes, there's an argument, are they changing it too much too often? But they're in the second season now. You're going to be changing your format probably for the rest of the championship's existence. I'd rather a format and a series turn around and say, this isn't working, fans don't like it, let's change it and listen to their feedback, than being stubborn and stuck in their ways. And I'm excited to see what the potential with the calendar. They were down in Dorset at the back end of last year, and I think taking this series to different places across the world, you can't say how important it is. I think Formula One at the moment misses out on the fact that they don't have a race in Africa. I think they've massively overlooked the potential there. I know they're focusing on America right now, but I think at some point that American bubble is going to burst and it's going to backfire if they don't get a grasp on other nations beyond North America. But at the end of the day, I think Extreme is an exciting potential, and it'll be interesting to see, because it's such a shorter calendar and kind of spotted in and out, whether drivers will mix it up with a couple of other things. I joke, I'd love to see Kimi Räikkönen do it, because I know he's got a rallying background, but I don't think
that would be incredible.
Happen.
Yeah, that's a great shout.
Well,
that would be brilliant.
He's gonna. Oh, what's he going to do? He's gone to work. Not Superbikes. Oh,
is it motocross?
Motocross. That's it.
Yeah.
I've got bikes in my head because I'm thinking of Herbie Blash earlier.
No, I agree. I think Extreme E, because it's only in its second season, I mean, you can look back even at the second up to, I think, like the 4th Formula E season, where they were swapping cars halfway through the races, right? And that dynamic now just doesn't happen at all in Formula E. And it was like a really important thing, and they completely changed that bit of the format. And I think now it is more engaging, where it's just 45-minute straight fight. We still have the attack mode in Formula E, but it's a bit more simple and obvious to the fans. And I think Extreme E is kind of learning that lesson as well, where it's taking feedback from the fans, but you can't take too much feedback, because you're also coming up with new ideas yourselves. So it's a bit of a balancing act of trying to make the fans happy, but also introducing new things that they've never seen before, that they don't know whether they like it or dislike it yet, because you have to have that opportunity to provide new ideas. And it's really important for racing series to be sort of encouraged to take those new ideas and take those risks, because kind of what it's all about, taking that risk and seeing how far you can take that risk, I think, is bringing that to a new series, and an electric off-road series with that kind of inbuilt messaging is I think it's got a potentially bright future for Extreme E, but we'll see. Sorry, go ahead.
I think it does. I think it fits quite a niche market quite well. It has a very unique spot compared to the likes of the other rallying series out there. I think also the fact that they've learned lessons from Formula E. For example, the argument whether fan boost is an artificial enhancement in Formula E for drivers that are popular, whereas in Extreme E, it's grid play and it's you pick where you start in the grid slot. So it has an impact, gets the fans involved without giving them too much of an advantage. And I like the fact that they've taken those lessons and learned them, because ultimately I think Formula One could do it a lot more often and look at where they've gone.
And as we look to the upcoming Formula E season, how do you see some of that championship playing out in terms of it feels like the team dynamic, especially with the Porsche 1-2 in Mexico, kind of what happened there? I mean, put a Porsche 1-2. That was just, for their first win in the sport, right? And then they come with a 1-2, completely mixes up the championship. And then you have De Vries, Mortara, Wehrlein now completely involved, and Van Dorn. It seems so mixed up and hard to predict, but are there any predictions you think you can have for the upcoming Formula E season?
The only prediction I always ever make with Formula E is to predict the unpredictable. Going into this season, I tipped Mercedes EQ to be strong because their powertrain was strong last year, and I think with Van Dorn and De Vries, they have probably one of the strongest lineups. I think Jaguar have just had horrendous luck. They would have had more points than they did, especially I feel bad. Like some Mitch Evans, I'm tipping to be a championship contender after last year and just has no luck there. I think probably my biggest surprise is Venturi. The fact that they've got such an experienced lineup in Mortara and Degrassi. They've also got Jerome D'Ambrosio as the team principal and kind of Susie Wolf in that CEO role. They've got an incredibly experienced and knowledgeable team around them that grasps the need and the concepts in Formula E very well. I think sometimes maybe the team potentially do play a bit more safe. I think Mortara could have got a podium. I don't think they tend to risk things as often. But then say the likes of Porsche, I said this the other day to a friend, is Porsche must think they are in a championship contending position. Otherwise, Lotterer would have fought Wehrlein for that win.
Yeah.
Because I think in his head, he thinks, right, not I'll give him the win, but I won't fight him for it. We'll bring home this 1-2. And at some point in the future, he can return the favour for me. Because if this was Neo, right at the back of the grid, fighting for that win, as much as your team would probably give your team orders and tell you not to fight, odds on somebody probably would, because it's such a shot in the dark. Whereas with Porsche, I think they know if they can get it together on a consistent basis, then they have a shot at it. And that's the problem. Probably the problem and the difficulty for a lot of those teams is just in Formula E, that consistency. I think it'll be more consistent now with the new qualifying format. We won't tend to see as many, I don't want to say road drivers, but those drivers say further towards the back of the grid, popping up the front when normally they probably wouldn't have done. You'll tend to see probably, I say, a group of about 4 or 5 teams fighting it up the front and the rest kind of fighting below the midfield to the back of the grid. So yeah, Formula it's just annoying that they've now got a massive break until April. I think they should have had a race sooner because it just feels too long.
I don't mind it because Jack Nicholls has agreed to come on the show because he doesn't have to work now for a month. So I don't mind that they've taken a break, but it's a little bit of a selfish reason. I think it speaks to just the quality of the series that they've been able to build in obviously a relatively short timescale, really. But the tracking of the whole history of Formula E, you can look just the cars, but the viewer numbers, the attendance at the races, I think just the quality of the racing product, the building of the tracks, the track design, all of it has progressed so much, even just like the graphics on the broadcast and just the overall quality of the professionalism almost of the company. It feels like we touched on Extreme E. If they can mirror that or get a similar kind of growth, provide that real base for electric motorsport, it's really then going to start asking the question more and putting the pressure on Formula One to move potentially even further towards electricity, maybe move down an even bigger battery component in the cars or something like that. I think it's a really interesting angle to follow electric motorsport because it's almost, they are obviously 2 separate series, but they're part of a similar movement together. And I think there's connections in ownership as well, aren't there, between Extreme E and Formula E, that they are tied together in their messaging in some way.
Completely. Well, they're both founded by Alessio Gag, and I think with Formula One as well, I think Formula E, in its interesting dynamic, has forced Formula One's hand in the sense that Formula E has the exclusive rights to be the FIA's only all-electric single-seater world championship, I think until like 2036 or something like that. So Formula One, I think Formula One will have to go down the hydrogen route. I think later down the line, a lot of people tipped at the start that Formula E had folded within the first 5 seasons. It get absorbed into Formula One and we did the end of it. Whereas now I think it's proven it's worth why people believed in it early on, even when things went wrong and you had to swap between cars and it wasn't always as simple as it probably is now. I think now it has that situation of Formula One is taking those lessons from Formula E, the fact that we're going into a lot more potential city centre locations with Formula One, like in Miami. I joked that Miami basis to be honest, just reminds me a lot of a Formula E track, because it has that close connection between the fans. Literally, they'll be round the corner for them in the middle of the city. You're not going to have to go out. Like, I love Silverstone to pieces, but unless you live in that area, it's a pain to get to. Whereas
and a pain to leave as well on race day. Oh my God, getting out on a race day.
Oh, I've been stuck in more traffic jams there than I care to remember. But it's that frustrating thing. Whereas I went to the London Prix last year, literally round the corner from the in the Excel Centre. My hotel was round the corner from it. 2 minutes to walk home. Could get there on the tube back and forth if I wanted to go out later on. And it was just so easy and so much more convenient, and it allowed that close connection. We were literally sat at one point in the grandstands watching it, and you were maybe a handful of meters away from the cars. Whereas in Formula One, I was even in general admission, a lot further away in the car. It felt like that distance was physically and kind of emotionally between the action. I think with Formula E now and Formula One, they've both got to take those lessons from each other and adapt to it. I think there's such a potential for growth of Formula E, whether they can harness it and get the coverage that it deserves, because I think it's so often overlooked. Whereas like with Formula One now, if you look at the televised figures, I think more people watched Abu Dhabi than watched the Super Bowl last year.
Wow.
And that's Formula One has a potential massive area of growth in America. If it can harness that, they're on the path to success, whether it'll bring other series along with it. Like say Formula 2, for example, that's had a massive or significant amount of growth over the past few years compared to, say, the GP2 days. So I think it's exciting. Motorsport seems to be on the up, and I think that was partially to do with how it dealt with the pandemic, because it was able to continue racing through it. It didn't have to stop and start so much in the same way. Once it got going, it got going. And
if the W Series can take advantage of that growth of Formula One, especially in America, and obviously they finished their second year. We spoke about how Formula E's growth over 8 years now. How, if the W Series can continue to be tied to the Formula One circuit, as in like tied to the event of the weekend, it's actually in a Grand Prix weekend, raising the engagement on social media, the popularity, the broadcast figures for those drivers is really, really critical to the growth of the series and the growth of the women in motorsport movement. It's, I think, really key for Formula One. They've been open about it, and I think it's key for the W Series to kind of take advantage of that opportunity. That the W Series is a real part of that growth strategy, and really important that it flows not only to Formula One but to those junior series that are properly integrated and not just a kind of exhibition race, but that the W Series really serves a purpose in the open wheel driver market.
Certainly, I think with W Series there's a clear level of investment in it. I think it wouldn't have, if you compare, say, that first season of W Series when it wasn't even on the Formula One calendar, there was some investment in it, but there wasn't by anywhere stretching the imagination the same level. The fact that they ended the season over in Texas, it was just incredible to see how much it had grown in such a relatively short space of time. I think time will tell how successful it is. I think the hard thing with W Series is the measure of it is always going to be, when do we get the first woman in Formula One again in far too long. And that's, I think, partially a lot of the pressure that's gone on Jamie Chadwick at the moment, is trying to see whether she'll get up there. I think with her situation it probably is a bit more difficult. Whether she will get that chance, I don't know. But I think W Series, its actual mark of its success shouldn't just be whether someone gets into Formula One. It should be how many women do we see, both in the engineering roles, the fact that they have these incredible young female engineers throughout their paddock, that their media teams, engineering, strategy, hospitality. The paddock is so full of people that get that level of experience, because ultimately you're not going to get into an F1 paddock if you don't have experience in many of those single-seater junior series. And also getting women into the driving seats in Formula E. Formula E has had female drivers before, has had female team principals, but it needs them back on that grid sooner rather than later. And that'll be the true measure, and how many more women it gets into grassroots motorsports, because you're never going to get a woman in Formula One if you don't get more women and more young girls into karting. Unfortunately, and I hate to say it, it's a numbers game at the end of the day. More men are going to get into Formula One because there are more young boys coming through the ranks. It's a lot harder, and there's a lot of pressure when you're the only woman I say, when you're the only woman in the room, there's always a lot more focus and pressure on you to perform. And I think that if they can encourage that, I think the Girls on Track movement, the FA Girls on Track movement, does wonderful work in bringing young women into the sport and giving them role models to look at and ways to progress. Because I think oftentimes when you don't have mentors or you don't come from a background that's worked in the industry, you kind of don't know where to go. Unfortunately, they have that network now and that support there. And I think with W Series, I'm incredibly hopeful and optimistic. And I think the fact that they run their own tests to make sure that hopefully at the end of the day with W Series, it will always be based on talent and not sponsorship. The fact that you don't have to bring in sponsorship to race in that series gives it an advantage over the, say, likes of Formula Region and things like that. And I think it slots quite well where it is. It's just now time will tell whether it can kind of complete its mission and how long it'll exist for. I'd see it existing probably for at least the next 10 years.
I think one of those standout stories from the W Series that really shows that it's not only a development ground for young female drivers, but also for people that had a chance maybe when they were younger and weren't able to deliver with that sponsorship package. Someone like Alice Powell, who was able to win Formula Regional, Formula Renault championships when she was younger against, it's a mixed series. It's not like she was competing in any subset or anything like that. She was genuinely going out there and beating people that went on to achieve higher, race seats and higher series than she was able to. And because of the budget, she wasn't able to keep competing. And the W Series comes in and gives her that chance to really show her quality again. And she takes it. She takes it really fully. And while Jamie Chadwick was champion of that, I think of last season, Alice Powell, especially at the British Grand Prix weekend, was really it was really awesome to see that there are multiple storylines in the series, not just young female drivers coming through, but that there's so many stories to tell in that category, and that it can play that role at the same time of being for younger female drivers, but also for Alice Powell to come back in and show that quality is still there. And she never left that quality. It was just the sport wasn't in the right place at the right time to deliver what it needed to for her. It's showing that there is a real cost to the approach of the junior series at the moment, that you lose drivers like her, that there is a gap that the W Series is filling. I think that was really key to see that that story play out, and really inspirational, I thought, to show that resilience to come back to racing after all of that and show her quality.
Definitely. I think with Alice Powell, unfortunately, she was a victim of circumstance, and I think it's quite interesting. She mentors Abby Pulling, and the fact that she was able to jump in that seat after losing her funding for British Formula 3, now she has the opportunity, hopefully, fingers crossed, she's guaranteed an automatic place in W Series for next year, but that she can make that step up at the end of the day. I also think one of the most inspirational people on the W Series grid is Sarah Moore, the first, when she got podium in Austria, the first LGBTQ plus person to be on a podium at a Formula One weekend. And I just remember, as an LGBTQ plus person myself, and seeing the reaction on social media, is how much motorsport has come forward. I think now we're at a pivotal time for equality, diversity and inclusion. We need to encourage people from more diverse backgrounds and have those role models, and seeing someone like you that you've never seen before in motorsport standing up there and achieving that success proves that even though the journey is difficult and it's not always going to be easy, that it is possible and there are opportunities there if you can find them and get that support network. I think that's probably the biggest thing I say to anyone ever wanting to go into anything to do with sport, particularly not just journalism, is a support network is the most valuable thing in the world. Even if they don't like sport themselves, just having that support network to know you can turn to them for advice and have those people that you can rely on ultimately. Because I think there's an interesting dynamic of, if you're coming up through particularly motorsport, you're not just bringing yourself up, you're bringing other people up along with you. So if Jamie Chadwick going through the ranks, when Susie Wolff, when she was reserve driver or test driver at Williams, inspired so many young women. As she went up through the ranks, other young women followed her. I had people following her across the seasons. When I was at the London Prix, I had someone message me to say that they were there and they were inspired to cover the racing as well. And I was thinking, crikey, if I've inspired someone, wow, I can't believe it, because there were people at that event that had inspired me in turn. And so I think it's also that circle of I don't say circle of life because it feels like I'm ripping off the Lion King, but that kind of circle of life, at the end of the day, you'll ultimately be wanting to bring people up with you. It's a journey that we're all on together to hopefully make the sport a better place.
And in your journey working for different motorsport companies and covering different series, are there particular mentors that you feel have really helped you along your way that have directly impacted that? We spoke a little bit earlier about some of your favorite creators. Are there any of those that you've been able to end up connecting with and collaborating with? You were once a fan and now you've been able to really get stuck into the industry. Some examples of that, maybe?
I'd say probably the biggest kind of mentor role model for me has to be Katie Fenn for WTF1. I think it's the odd thing of now admiring her for so long and admiring her work, and then kind of coming through the ranks and now working with it, and we'll be on the chat discussing ideas and bouncing off each other. It's something that I couldn't have imagined. To be honest, 5 years ago, I would never have imagined I'd be in this situation. I also think Claire Cossum, she's currently working, I know, at Eurosport covering the Winter Olympics, but she used to be the Formula 1 writer for the Express, and she previously worked for the BBC. She's been incredible. She was, funny enough, I'd actually met her for the first time when I was doing my placement at the Express, and then ended up seeing her at the London Prix, and it was having that person, especially the first time I ever went into a media pen, her and Hazel Southwell were just wonderful, because I'd never done a media pen before in person, didn't know the protocol, was scared out of my boots to do it, and just instantly making me feel more comfortable being like, actually, you know, hey, maybe this driver might be best to speak to first, try this and things like that. There's also people like Helena Hicks, who runs Females in Motorsport. She is an absolute inspiration to so many people and worked in media and comms, but she's done so much to encourage other young women to get into there. And I'm fortunate to be friends with her, and I think she's just incredible. Also, the likes of, very good shout out to Emily Hogg at Jaguar, who's one of the press officers, media officers there. There's just such a supportive network of people in the industry, and I think that is the greatest thing, is getting to know those people both as a mentor and as a friend, and having admired them, because you learn so many lessons. The greatest lessons I've ever learned in motorsports, but in life, are from the people that I've been surrounded by. And I think that's, I always love the thing, especially with social media, a lot of people have it over who you should ever take advice off. And I always say the line is, I'm not going to worry about criticism from someone I wouldn't ask for advice from, because at the end of the day, someone's always going to criticize you, someone's always not going to like what you've written. But getting that positive reception, like when I get texted, oh my god, this article's hit so many thousand reads or things like that, or this one's got suddenly blown up massively on Twitter, seeing those articles and actually having that pride in your work and knowing that you've done a good job at the end of the day is just so rewarding, and it's always wonderful to get kind of positive reaction from things.
Fascinating. And then in terms of finding topics for your articles, do you feel that there's any ever sort of incentive or a bit of conflict of interest there in looking to be the most popular or looking to be the most engaged with article that week? Do you feel that the pull to be as extreme or as controversial as possible, do you just not engage with that and write what you find to be interesting, or can you feel that at times maybe influencing your writing?
I think it always does have some form of an influence. I think numbers, we know what drivers are popular. For example, if you're in the UK, Lando Norris is probably going to be Lando Norris, Lewis Hamilton, Daniel Ricciardo, Max Verstappen are going to draw in attention on articles. Esteban Ocon, Nicholas Latifi, love them as much as I do, don't draw in the same numbers often, unless they say something massively controversial. There are always going to be some drivers more popular, some series more popular. That's why Formula One will ultimately at the moment get more coverage than say Formula One or Formula E or Extreme E. It does have an influence in that sense in terms of what you prioritize. Like today, with all the news breaking about the likes of Michael Massey and Otmar Zafinaar going to Alpine, we knew Massey was going to be popular. I was working on other articles, parked them immediately, jumped on the Michael Massey content because we knew it'd be popular, and we knew there were so many questions that people were going to have. You could kind of predict it in a way, but it doesn't make me want to be particularly controversial. I always think I'd like to hope I'm quite balanced in my work. I kind of take the view of sometimes in an article, I'll give my opinion and then also play devil's advocate and also put the opposite opinion to allow people to come to their own conclusions, because at the end of the day, I'm not there to influence how people think. I'm there to influence them to think about what I've discussed. I think that's I think that's the thing that I probably learned having done politics in the day, is that I don't want people to automatically think the way I think just because they've read my article. I want them to be able to come to their own conclusions. And if I can present both sides of the argument, or present facts that maybe people didn't consider when looking at a person or looking at a topic, that makes it the rewarding bit at the end of the day. I think sometimes there is a temptation within the industry to be the most controversial, to find the most controversial topic, or to twist people's words. I have a hatred for it. I know people that have done it over the years, and they'll twist something someone has said to not have that implication. And I'm like, no, actually, if someone says something in an interview and I've got it on my dictaphone and they say, oh, actually, I didn't mean it like that, can I redo it? I'll say, yeah, absolutely, because I'm not there to kind of trap someone into saying something they didn't mean. I'd rather convey their actual words rather than having to play. I don't like playing to the most popular views. I'll play to the true part of journalism and what the authenticity of it, and not kind of a let's just pick the most controversial thing to get clicks, because at the end of the day, clicks are one thing, but just because someone clicks on your article, if they think, oh, they've been misled, they're not going to come back and read another one, and it's sustaining that readership by being authentic.
Do you think that in your interviews and your talks with drivers and people that work at teams and people around motorsport, do you have a conscious technique or a style in those interviews, or do you think that just with your experience, it's become a subconscious, natural habit that you're able to pull information out of people and get the right stories across? How do you approach interviewing? Is it different for every person, or do you have an overarching style?
I'd say it's tweaked for every driver. I think there's a couple of things you have to consider. I think probably the main one is oftentimes the language barrier. Say, for example, in motorsport, we've got a lot of drivers from very different nationalities, some first language English, some not. There's some times where I can make a joke and a pop culture reference that some drivers will get, others don't. I did for one interview once with James Barkley, the team principal at Jaguar, and we were talking about football at one point and mentioned the fact that I'm from Wrexham, and we were talking about the Ryan Reynolds takeover, because then it led into conversations about other things. But I know if I mentioned Wrexham FC to one of the other drivers who has never even heard of Wrexham, it wouldn't provide any use. And I think it's finding the individual things about drivers that they like to talk about, sometimes going in with a softer question first to get them to open up. And also, I think it's hard on Zoom. I think that the difficulty of Zoom interviews, you can't read people's body language as easily. I think, especially if you ever have a delay in an interview, it's just a nightmare. But it has that thing of you can't read how they're reacting. And some drivers, naturally, I think some drivers are a lot more open than others. Some will happily talk for 5 minutes on one question. Others will give you one-word answers, especially if they've had a bad race. If you've ever interviewed a driver or anyone in motorsport after their team has had a bad race, empathy, as much as you've got to ask those hard and difficult questions of why they performed so badly, I never start with the immediate question of, so what went wrong? Because it shuts them down instantly, where it's like, right, talk about the start of the race or maybe some of the positives first, and then go into it, kind of almost drip feed an interview that way. And I don't mind so much doing the longer interviews if it allows me to get a more well-rounded quote and discussion to be able to include, whereas I know some people instantly like, right, shortest interview possible, 2 questions and done, whereas I much prefer long form interviews. And I think that is the handy thing with interviews. Sometimes you do have those shorter slots, so you have to get it instantly, but other times if you can get that longer thing and kind of wean them into the discussion, you do tend to get more out of it.
And so who would be, in your memory, who's the easiest to interview? Who do you ask one question and they go off and answer 5 in the same answer?
There's a few, to be fair. Oscar Piastri was really good to interview. He's one of the first ones I ever did have as a video interview to go online. And because he was living on his own or living with playing Formula 2 team, he'd previously lived in the UK, and we were talking about the difficulties of at one point joking about the difficulties of living on your own, and he was joking about his flatmate not being able to cook and things like that. And then we ended up in just, I said it was just very random one, and he asked about university life because that's where I was at the time, and it was like kind of mutual conversation. I like an interview to be a conversation and not just a, I ask you a question, you answer. If they want to ask questions back to me, they're more than welcome to, and it was that reciprocal conversation. Mitch Evans from Jack Threlfall Show, always a favourite. He was the first driver. I remember the first time I interviewed him. He was the first driver that wasn't in F1 that I had followed all the way back in like 2012, 2013, when he was in like GP2 or GP3. I'd followed his whole career, and then getting to interview him. And he talks a lot, and he gives such good quotes because he's willing to go into depth about things. And also Nick de Vries. Nick de Vries is a favourite because he has my funniest ever interview moment. Whilst at university, the problem was because of lockdown, I had to interview in university halls. So you could see my bed in the background. So I turned my cushions around to make sure it was kind of as blank slate as you could make it. And the difficulty was, he turned around, was chatting with saying about how tidy my room was, and then made a joke about what's that on your bed. And I turned around, and it's my cushion of Anne Boleyn, second wife of Henry VIII. I forgot to turn it around.
Fair enough.
Key piece of advice to anyone ever doing interviews from home: check your background. I thought I'd covered it, but it literally broke the ice instantly, and we could have a laugh and a joke about it and get into that interview. And because I'd been so nervous about doing it, instantly the nerves were gone, because he was just like, "What's that?" And then I had to explain what it was. He's like, "Oh, that's cool. Like, cool, I have another interest." So I like, he was like, "Oh, I like this," and other things he gets up to. And then we got into Formula E and got great quotes out of it. And so I would say, be yourself. That is one thing advice to interviews. Don't try and be someone you're not, because they can tell. If you're trying to be overly formal and overly serious, and you're not a serious person, it just doesn't fit well with the room.
And those nerves and that anxiety when you're interviewing a big name or someone that you're a big fan of and you've been following for a long time, is that something that you feel fades quite quickly? And once you become so involved the way you are now in motorsport, that do you feel like you lose those nerves, or are they a good sign, a sign that you're still involved in it? How do you view that idea of nervousness?
I think nervousness for me, it's a difficult one, because I tend to get quite, strangely, despite having been in journalism, I get very nervous in social interactions, especially with people I don't know. So going into the Formula E paddock for the first time, I was so nervous I couldn't actually stand to do an interview because my legs wouldn't stop shaking. And I interviewed Sam Bird, and immediately, as soon as I got to Jaguar, they were like, "Oh, should we go sit on the wall and do it? That's easier." And I was thinking, thank God, because I'm too nervous and I can't really stand. And I think that, for me, it doesn't really go away, but it's how you deal with them. I think you can't kind of let it paralyze you in that sense. You can't be so nervous I'm shaking and I can't do an interview. It's kind of something that I get a bit nervous now before I go to the interview, but that nerves make sure that I'm prepared, that I've read over my notes, checked any research, if there's been an incident in the race, making sure I know exactly what caused it. Because sometimes you'll have situations where things are going to the stewards and you won't know exactly what happens, and then you'll have a steward's decision pop up a minute before you're due to go into an interview, and you're like, right, check it, make sure I've got that background, tweak a question if I need to. I like notes. I think notes are handy, but you can't rely on them as a crutch, especially in the media pen, because you've normally got your phone in one hand, dictaphone or something else in the other, and you're squashed in. You normally can't have a big block A4 piece of notes with like 20 questions on. You've literally got to instantly shorten things. And if you've caught, say, the interview that they've done for the national media that's been broadcast on TV, you know which questions are scratched. So I think nerves can be beneficial, but you can't let them overtake you at the end of the day.
And when you're in that media pen, what's your approach between the other journalists? Because it seems like something where a bit of competitiveness could creep in, and you're collaborating in the sense that you're both doing a similar job, but it's also kind of individual. You're writing your own perspective, and you're writing in your style, and you're writing with your name at the end, not anyone else's. How do you approach that competition? Do you feel it, or do you just not really think about it?
I don't really think about it too much. I think it kind of depends on, I think, both the paddock, the publication, and kind of the situation. So say, for example, with WTF1, because we're oftentimes covering stuff that's covered on broadcast, we know that quote is probably going to get picked over by 10 publications at the same time because they've all watched the same broadcast we have. But say with being in person at Formula E, it was one of the ones of you can't interview all the drivers. Their media pen is very much kind of not a free fall, but they kind of dip in and out. So a lot of the drivers, you might only be able to catch the 3 in one go. So sometimes if I go, right, I'm going to talk to this driver, I'll turn to someone that I might know might be friends and saying, right, are you going to speak to that driver? Oh, if you're covering that question already, if it's not something that they want exclusively for themselves, or it's a question that they think, oh, I've asked questions for other people before, added it into mine because it wasn't really a question I wanted to cover, but it was something more niche that they wanted for their publication. And I'm like, right, here's my recording. You use your bit of mine, I'll use your bit of yours. And it's like collaborative effort. I think it does depend. Some places are, and I think some people are instantly competitive. I rather feel that I joke I'm competitive in pretty much every other aspect of my life. For some reason, that aspect I don't like to be, because I think at the end of the day, it doesn't aid journalism. I think if you're competitive in the sense of, oh, it's right, I've got to get the most views, the most clicks, things like that, it doesn't work. And also, when you're writing stories, if you're constantly comparing yourself to other people, it kind of ruins the fun and the enjoyment out of it. It's like that phrase, comparison is the thief of joy. Is as much as you look at other people's work and go, right, what can I do better? You shouldn't instantly go, oh my God, I'm rubbish and that person's a million times better. You should think, right, why are they better? What can I do? What can I learn? But what's also instinctively me about my writing?
And how do you manage that positive approach to self-criticism when you're looking back over how many, thousands of articles you've written? How do you keep improving? How do you make the next one better than the one that you wrote last week? Is that something that is conscious, or do you just feel that naturally, as you become more experienced, more varied and more wide-ranging in your knowledge of the sport, your understanding and your passion for it is going to change, and that will naturally shine through in the writing? Or is it a conscious effort of thinking, or maybe last week I didn't hit this angle for the interview or this theme of it perfectly, and I'll bring that through in a conscious way?
I would say for me, it's probably more of a conscious thing. I very much like, with WTF1, that is the benefit of it being such a fan accessible platform, is I've got 2 parents who watch Formula One. My dad will read every article that I do. He will not like it if he doesn't like, he won't like on social media if he doesn't and have not read the article beforehand, which is handy when you go downstairs and you get criticism off your parents for your own writing, going, I don't like this bit of the article. I think you could have phrased this differently. Or one of my friends has not a clue about motorsport, doesn't like it, doesn't want anything to do with it, but will read my articles. And I always use that as kind of a litmus test. If she can understand what I've written, despite having no background in it, I've made my article accessible enough. And then I have other friends that will read it that know more and be like, oh, did I maybe add this little bit in? And fortunately, having done a news journalism course, I've got friends in likes of lifestyle consumerism journalism, investigative journalism, fashion journalism, some of them working in social media and comms. We all have a related experience that we've all gone through, but also a different way we've applied it, which makes it quite nice when you get other people's angles into it. I also have a thing, every article I read or every article that I've ever written, I have notebooks stashed everywhere with the 3 positive things I think about my article and 3 things I'd like to change, whether it's simple things like, oh, I think I didn't use a feature image that captures the best tone of the story or doesn't capture the audience. Oh, the headline could be better. I think that's one of the biggest things I've learned, is how different headline writing can be across publications. So I can put puns and jokes and quite short headlines. Some places are very specific in character counts and things like that. But I would say for me, it's always been kind of a conscious effort of a kind of improve along the way, take feedback on social media. If I've had people criticize things that I've written on social media, and sometimes it does hurt, it does sting, but you kind of think, this many thousands of people have read it, right, why have they said this? For example, one person say, oh, that I didn't like this joke or something's made, and then you realize, oh, fairs, I've probably made a joke that's a bit too niche, that some people might not get, or use a phrase. They joke about, there's an article saying about phrases that are dying out in kind of regular English language use. I use a lot of them in my everyday life. I'll use things that people already don't understand, or niche words that I'll use in my local area that our American audience have never heard before, or things around spelling and things like that. Of when you've got a global audience, you're never going to please everyone, but it's just finding ways to improve it and adapt it and ultimately just grow and be able to be versatile, because I can write for different platforms now. At the start, I could only write very much a kind of regional media kind of strict format for a website, whereas now I can write scripts for YouTube and come up with ways to make topics engaging that most people probably would never care about. So it's nice to have that versatility and adaptability. And it's ultimately, if you can say you're adaptable and prove it on a CV, employers love it, because it's such an asset, especially amongst not just your skills, but also across different sports.
And what's some stuff that you're working on at the moment that you feel really captures that spirit of self-improvement? What are some articles maybe that you've got in your documents at the moment that you haven't published yet? You could explain a little bit about how you've looked to improve them maybe, or how you've looked to adapt them to be the best they can be.
I would say actually probably the ones today, funny enough, that was a big test, because there was obviously we had breaking news of Ferrari's launch, the Mike Massey stuff, and miles after that, we had kind of 3 major stories break all within very quick succession, and my colleagues have to go and they record a podcast when the Massey news dropped. I had the editing team to access, but it was my responsibility to write those articles, and writing an article under that amount of time pressure, knowing that you've got to get an article that's clear, concise, to the point, but having our brand of humour about it. I couldn't have just wrote 4 sentences, Otmar's been appointed to Alpine, or Michael Massey's been sacked. Couldn't write that in immediately. It was find a way to make it humorous, to make it relatable, and put them up very quickly, explain changes. I think it's about the massive one as well, the fact that we had the new race directors, for people in Formula One who have never heard of them. How do I make these people both relatable in terms of their experience? So talking about Eduardo Freitas's WEC experience, the fact that he's managed in Le Mans 60 cars in 4 classes in wet, dark and challenging conditions, but also the fact that he likes to spend his weekend marshalling at his local racetrack, and finding that kind of niche element to it. I also think with scripts, and to be honest with a lot of articles that I've done, is I'm known for overwriting. I have very much a lawyer's mindset of research. I've got multiple books on Formula One. If I come up with a topic that I'm covering, I'll research it to death. I'll end up with 17 pages of research, and then have to cut that down to say 2 pages. And it forces you to streamline and also to break things up. If I have to break an article up into say 4 different articles amongst 4 subtopics, I have the freedom to do that. I think my favourite ever example of an article that was both an area that I kind of knew, but one I had to make relatable and had to tweak a lot to find a way to make it not boring, was how the FIA investigation was going to work in the Mercedes appeal. I'd originally, once they'd published that Mercedes were going to, or they'd launched an intention to appeal, the amount of people I saw putting on Twitter going, it's going to the Supreme Court in the UK. And I thought, no, it's not. It's going to the FIA's Court of Appeal and then potentially National Court Arbitration in Sport. And I thought, right, there's an article instantly there, feature, how does this appeals process work? What are the differences? What are the rules governing it? And even things like making sure that the hours that they had, some publications put the wrong hours in to their article of how long they had and things like that. And also people read it. It was really well viewed at the time, and it was a surprise, because I thought, oh, most people won't actually care beyond by reading that they're doing an appeal and this is where it goes. But no, a lot of people read it, understood it, and commented saying, actually, no one else is covering how the mechanics of this work. They're just saying they're going to an appeal and this is how long it takes. So that was definitely probably I think that is my favorite article I've ever written, just because it combined all of my backgrounds and things that I'd learned, especially at the time, because Abu Dhabi was just such a hectic weekend, being still relatively new into the role. It very much, I joke, that back end of the last season was very much thrown in at the deep end, and having just to adapt so quickly and manage your time. I think time management, I probably understated it when I first got started in journalism, but you have to be able to write so quickly and being able to break things down. If you've got a press release that's 4 pages long, right, what are the key points? What do people actually want to know, and identifying that?
And what are some stories for the upcoming Formula One season? What are you keeping your eye on specifically? Obviously, there's so much action throughout every team, but what's really capturing your interest for the upcoming Formula One season?
Oh, I think the calendar, it'll be interesting to see, especially with the likes of Miami during the calendar, I think, and how kind of the sports become, I don't want to say Americanized, but the American influence on Formula One, having had the Liberty Media takeover as well. I think how probably the midfield are going to cope, whether there's a lot of rumours about how the new regulation changes, whether they're actually going to make fighting closer between the teams. I think a lot of people probably underestimated the intrinsic advantage the likes of Mercedes, Red Bull and Ferrari have because of the budget cap. They've got Winters. Haas don't even have a simulator for their drivers. They have to, well, I know Mick Schumacher does use Ferraris, and they've kind of got a satellite centre there, but that bridge in the facilities that they have isn't going to be taken away just because there's a budget cap. And I think at the moment that will be interesting to see whether, I think it'll make the top 3 teams and maybe top 4 with McLaren closer. And I think the overall gap between the front and the back end of the grid will be tighter. But I don't think you're going to be seeing a Haas fighting for, to be honest, championship points very often, because there's just so much inbuilt stuff that isn't going to change in a little while. I think Red Bull's development and their driver academy, that's the one driver academy I'm very much keeping a close eye on, because you've got the situation with Pierre Gasly, whether he'll stay at AlphaTauri, Lewis Hamilton retires, although at this moment I don't know what. I still debate whether he will retire next season. I think he'll.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah, it's a tough question, because I feel like if he wins the 8th title, what has he got left to achieve? He has every record. He has the most titles ever. He has won in that, proven he's a successful driver in basically the 4th era of regulations. If you're looking at 2007, 8, 2009, obviously McLaren didn't have a good car. The next 4 years, he was competitive pretty much most weekends, more than not. He wasn't the best driver. Sebastian Vettel was the best car and the best driver for most of those races, but he was still hugely competitive. And then you give him that Mercedes car in the new era, we give him another set of regulations. If he can achieve that, take that title, especially with how invested he is now with his foundation and all his off-track leadership and mentorship for so many different organizations, I can't see him staying past 2020 if he wins, but I'm sure, I have no idea as well. It's not like I've asked him, but I feel like I feel like there's so little left to achieve. But then if he loses to Russell, and if Russell really puts up a Rosberg-like challenge there in qualifying and shows that the gap is closable, then maybe that kind of passion, that drive to be competitive, is going to maybe be reignited by George Russell. I think that storyline of Russell in the Mercedes is really, I just am so excited to see what happens there, because I got that perfect little taster at the end of 2020 of what, how quickly Russell was able to adapt to that weekend in Bahrain. You give him those full resources. I mean, if he's going to be able to do anything like what he was able to do in 2020 in that Mercedes seat, I just think that challenge is set up so well for this year. I'm really looking forward to it.
Oh, same. I think Ross, it's been a long time coming, him getting that full-time Mercedes seat. I think now he's more well-rounded than ever. I think that maybe when, say with 2020, if they promoted him straight after that, would it have been a bit too premature? As much as I'd have loved to have seen him in that seat last year, I think now he's known the highs and the lows of motorsport. He's seen, with Williams particularly, how to become a team leader. I think much like Latifi doesn't have that same role within the team that Russell had. It was clear who was top dog. Even though Latifi got closer towards the end of the season, Russell was always the force, the leader, the one to be reckoned with. And I think with Lewis, hopefully it'll kind of reignite that spark in him. I think also with changes to race management, the regulation changes, things like that, he's got a point to prove. I think it's interesting, say with the future of Toto Wolff, I would love to see Lewis, after he steps back from Formula One, go into a team principal role. I think that'd be
amazing. Yeah.
Him and Sebastian Vettel, but I think there is that kind of battle of a generation dynamic in probably most of the top teams, even like McLaren, as much as I hate saying battle for generation because it makes Daniel Ricciardo sound really old, but he is now, I think, the 5th oldest driver on the grid after Raikkonen's departure. Is the only one that doesn't really have that same battle is Ferrari at the moment. Alpine's got it, Aston Martin's got it, and it's now, I think, the tide's beginning to turn into the younger generation's favour, and it's a natural thing. It happens. Like at one point in time, Lewis was the young gun fighting up there, but now we've seen kind of a growth of a lot of young drivers come through very quickly, and there is that potential that maybe, say, at the end of this season or at the end of next season, you could see 3 or 4 of the older drivers on the grid go. And I think Sebastian Vettel's also an interesting one because I really hope he'll take a role in the FIA. I think that would be good. Him and Lewis, I think, I can't see, given how much they've given to the sport across their lives, and also how much campaigning they're doing around social issues and things like that, I can't see him doing a Kimi Räikkönen suddenly going off the grid and things like that. They'll stick around in some way, shape or form to the future of motorsport, fingers crossed, because it's an exciting time. Then with the 2026 regulation changes and power unit changes, you've got the situation where it'll bring the likes of, say, Porsche in, obviously Maserati going into Formula E, but whether BMW will come across, things like that. There's just so much change. And it seems, compared to how I think a lot of fans felt in, like, 2018, 2019, it seems a lot of hope for the future of Formula One. It seems now it's got a direction that it didn't have a few years ago.
And do you think for Guanyu Zhou, we spoke about him at the start of the show, what would an achievable goal look like for him in his Formula One season? Because having Valtteri Bottas as a teammate, I mean, Bottas was good enough at the start of the hybrid era to earn that Mercedes seat, which was the most competitive seat in the sport after Rosberg retired. He was a really, really fast driver, really experienced now, has a lot of race wins, more than most people that ever drive in Formula One. And Zhou is going to be up against that as a teammate with the same equipment. Do you feel that, I mean, he has any chance against Valtteri, or whether it's just going to be a development year like it was for the Haas pairing last year?
I would probably say a development year for him. I think a lot of people, as much as I don't think Valtteri Bottas is amazing, he is a very strong driver. And I think at Alpha now, look at once that deal got announced, the pressure was off and he performed. At Alpha, he knows he has that security in that team leadership role, the same way Raikkonen did. I think for Zhou, it's get as close as you can. Try and outperform him. If you can beat him and get more points than him, brilliant. If you can't, get as close as you can and don't get beaten by the Haas. I think if they can outperform Williams, that would be great. I think them and Williams are kind of probably in the fight for 7th and 8th. I think Haas are probably going to be at the back, unfortunately. I think then it's just get as close and try and get the points as often as not. But I think for Zhou, also for him, it's probably hope that Theo Pourchaire doesn't perform well in Formula 2, because if Theo Pourchaire performs, he's mentored by Frederick Vasseur. They will want him in that seat because they now have control of it and they don't have to cede that seat over to Ferrari for one of their juniors. So I think for Zhou, it's just hope he can get to grips with that car quite quickly. And if Valtteri Bottas struggles with the car, then it only puts him in an advantage, and just hope that the rest of circumstances go his way, that he can justify, even if he can't keep that Alfa Romeo seat, that maybe he could go elsewhere.
And do you think that that Pourchaire is a real star for the future? You think, he's got his mentorship, he's got that path set out for him. Do you think he's earned it? Do you think he deserves that, or is he taking someone's spot that could be better than him?
I certainly think he's earned it. I think you can't deny he's fast, he's talented. It reminds me in some ways of Max Verstappen, a lot of his junior career, where, say, Oscar Piastri, I would say, was more consistent. Theo Pourchaire was probably quick on occasions. Although saying that, Oscar Piastri actually had multiple pole positions last year, so I feel like I'm probably understating his qualifying speed. But for Pourchaire, yes, he has that academy role. I think he does have a clear progression to Formula One. I think, to be honest, of all the Sauber Academy drivers, he is the one that deserves it. And I think it's interesting that he didn't get poached elsewhere. I am surprised the likes of, say, Mercedes, even Ferrari to some degree, didn't try and poach him. Or even, actually, to be honest, Alpine actually would have been, given the French connection, would have been the logical place. And I think with Sauber, they're more willing to stand on their own 2 feet this season. I don't think the relationship with Ferrari is as strong. They're not using as many of Ferrari's components this time on, things like the gearbox. they're very much going to try and hopefully with the budget cap be able to be, I don't think they're going to be a front runner or championship contender anytime soon. Kind of like a Force India, I would tout that's Alpha's aim, is they want to be a solid midfield team, and Pourchaire can do that. The issue is whether he can go elsewhere, because I think there's now, although like say the likes of Red Bull getting Sergio Perez in, there is very much a thing for the top teams now. They want to bring their own talent through. Ferrari, if Mick can perform, they'll eventually bring him in. Likes of Red Bull, whether it's Gasly, but whether Gasly would actually go back is another matter. Whether it's Lawson, Vips, or Hauger, they're going to want to bring an academy junior into that seat and prove that they've had them the whole journey and it's their development that they've been a part of. So for Pourchaire, I think if he could perform and show that maturity and consistency, he'll get a place in F1. But where the future lies depends on Alpha's performance.
And how do you see the role of esports developing and changing as we look to global motorsport? It seems like even through the pandemic, a huge amount, and then recently with the virtual Le Mans race and Max Verstappen competing in that, the eyes have been pointed towards esports. And even with the Race of Champions a couple of weekends ago, having esports drivers there, and they're really getting involved, getting stuck in with the real life drivers, I suppose, is maybe not the right way to phrase it, but they seem to be going up in stock, the esports drivers, especially the Formula One virtual series seems to be like with Bölükbaşı, right? He's the man. He's coming into Formula 2. He's that representative for esports. How do you see his future and wider the role of esports changing?
I think the role of esports has changed exponentially over the past couple of years. I think it's also coincided with the fact that junior series have got increasingly more expensive. I can never see a driver going from esports directly to Formula One. I don't think he'll ever get super license points to be able to do that. But it's that transition into the likes of Ken Bölükbaşı going into Formula 2. It does provide more affordable pathway into those seats originally. I think it's an exciting prospect having that access to it, especially from those from, say, poorer backgrounds, to be able to go into esports and then potentially move into a seat later on and get that sponsorship and kind of brand awareness. I think the drivers help. I think Lando Norris, the fact that he's kind of, I hate saying the new generation, but you've always had a driver that's changed the perception of what a driver is. I think Lewis Hamilton previously did it with a lot of his moves outside of the track into things like fashion and music. And now you've got Lando Norris with this kind of quadrant setup, very much moving the aspect of what it means to be a driver and having those off-track passions. It's paved the way for a lot of esports to get into Formula One. It's also paved the way for a lot of new fans to get into the sport, and also fans to then get into esports as well. For me, esports, if F1 can fund it and invest in it in the way that it should and have it kind of coincide with Formula One, it'd be interesting if they did an esports calendar that coincided, say, on the Thursday, now that they're not having the media session, having, say, esports rounds on the Thursday for the same race weekend that's happening, like, say, the British Grand Prix and things like that, would be incredibly interesting, and it would tie them together, because at the moment it does kind of feel like esports goes at the back end of the F1 season. But I think Lucas Blakeley in the kind of Race of Champions when he beat Sebastian Vettel,
that was awesome.
That social media, that reaction I was watching, I just thought, this is the thing, is esports. A lot of people think, oh, it's just driving the screen. And for Jan Marlborough was speaking on Formula E last weekend, and he does the sim work for Nissan EDAMS, and he's come from the virtual racing background. Is how different it is. You don't have that same feedback, because on wheel it's force feedback in your hands, whereas when you're driving it's through your whole body. At the end of the day, esports provides a new pathway into Formula One, I think, and if F1 want to take it seriously, they need to find a way to feed it into the sport and develop a closer connection between the two, because at the moment it's growing and it has so much potential. I think it's probably that and W Series are the biggest opportunities for potential Formula One has for new drivers in the next 10 years.
I think it's really interesting you make the point about the budget and how a driver who doesn't have the budget to compete in the European Junior Karting Series or in Formula Regional could invest instead in that esports setup and move to compete in those series. And also, we spoke earlier about the role of social media engaging Twitch live streaming And that those kind of platforms and that side of the fan engagement, it almost, a lot of these esports drivers, the successful ones. I mean, of course, Jano Otmir stands out as the biggest, most successful Formula One esports driver. Not only is he that figure, he's the driver, but he runs his own YouTube channel and he runs these Twitch streams, and his social media side. It's so intertwined with that fan engagement and that growth of the internet. If they can tie that esports in, maybe find an American esports successful driver or tie it into its expansion there, it seems like that's another big component alongside the W Series, alongside the wider movement to sustainability and those sort of things. I agree. I think esports should be a real part of that integrated push to grow motorsport. To leave it behind, I think, would be a really big mistake, because you would leave behind all those people that are economically removed from competing in real life series, I suppose, with higher budgets.
Yeah, I think that is actually, I completely agree with you on it. I think with esports as well, you've got the investment from the teams. If you look at, for example, Red Bull's esports program, the likes of Marcel Kiefer and things like that, him streaming with Formula 2 driver Liam Lawson, that brings a closer connection between the two. Ferrari, the fact that they seem a lot more invested in it, I think, both in the sense of F1 needs to invest in it and give it the platform on race weekends that it deserves, but also I think we need to see more investment from the individual teams. Some teams do automatically. I think McLaren is the best example of it. The fact that McLaren Shadow were part of their F1 launch, they have, I joke, it is the perfect way to launch a team, because they've not just launched the F1 team, they launched the brand across IndyCar, across Extremely, across Formula 1 and esports. That is how you bring them together cohesively and have that passion to do it properly. I think sometimes there's a little bit of, oh, we'll dip our toes in this, we'll dip our toes in that. Actually, no, you need to go and invest in it and there needs to be, I think, more interconnectedness between teams that have programs elsewhere. The fact that Ferrari have presence in GT racing and endurance, there needs to be a great occasion between them, so with Aston Martin as well. And hopefully we're starting to see that. I think Formula One has had not a lot of change for a while, and then suddenly I think the COVID pandemic has accelerated it. It's had so much change that forced a lot of drivers onto streaming. But some of them, I don't think George Russell, for example, will go back to streaming.
Probably not.
I know Alex Albon maybe a little bit, but I think some of them won't do it. I think Ferrari tends to be a stricter team in terms of their social media and things like that, and they have common side things. So I don't see Charles Leclerc going back to it full time. But I think Lando's presence and the way that changed the fan interaction, at the end of the day, that forced that glass wall or glass barrier between the drivers, the teams, and the fans ultimately to shatter. And that is the one positive you can take out of everything that's happened. Is I've never seen F1 teams and F1 so engaged with their fans as they've been right now.
Amazing. Well, there we are, the future of Formula One. I think one final question we can wrap it up with would be, what's a bold prediction we can look back on at the end of the Formula One season? We're going to be in December after it all. We can look back on this podcast. Give me a prediction that you think you can claim right now.
Oh, I don't know if it classes as bold anymore, but I'm going to go Carlos Sainz outscores Charles Leclerc.
Okay. I thought you were going to say champion for a second there, but fair enough.
Oh no! I don't, as much as I think that Ferrari looks amazing, I don't think
it does. It does look good, right? I think the way the pointy nose as well. They've got a little special feature they've leaked already. If they're going to stick with that pointy nose, and then it's like the 1990 car, right? That's like the big inspiration for it. That black and red, and having the whole floor be integrated in that color. I think they've done a really good job there. I'm trying to think what my bold prediction would be. All right, so we've got Carlos Sainz outscore Charles Leclerc again, right? Because he did that this season, or did that last season, so he can go back-to-back seasons outscoring Charles Leclerc. I think I'll go with Sebastian Vettel wins a race. That's my prediction.
I have to admit, I was debating that one. The Aston Martin looks good. It looks racing. It looks very put together. And the fact that they've got Mike Crack in as their team principal should be an interesting development for them.
Unfortunate name, though. Horrible day on Twitter that was. Oh, my God, mate. People went off.
Yeah, I had to refrain myself from making jokes in my article about it because it was just so tempting.
I thought it's WTF1. That seems right up the WTF1 crack.
As much as I like to make a joke, I thought that one was a bit far.
Fair enough. Yeah, I think, well, brilliant. There we go. We've got our predictions. I think we can end the show there. This has been brilliant. I mean, we've done, I think, hour and 45 minutes in total, but we've covered so much. I think it'll be really engaging and rewarding for people looking to get down that path of sports journalism, and some of your lessons in terms of self-reflection and finding your path and your network in the industry have been really brilliant. So thank you very much, Hannah, for coming on. I'll let you promote anything you like to promote. And this has been the Jack Threlfall Show.
Oh, thank you for having me.